Does anybody know what an ogre is? Okay, Luke knows what an ogre is. What is an ogre? A monster. Yeah, it's a monster. What are some of the characteristics of ogres? They're mean. They're always mean. Yeah. Grumpy. At least grumpy. What's that? Scary. Yeah. Yeah, gross. Okay. I didn't have that one down. That's true. The evil. Yeah. They're often a sadist too. You know, a sadist I was looking up is someone who derives pleasure from inflicting pain or humiliation on others. And the ogres wait under the bridges to catch you when you come by, do mean things to you. You remember those fairy tales when we were kids, right? The ones that your parents read as you were going to sleep, and then you were so petrified after they got through reading about the ogre or the Little Red Riding Hood trying to make it through the woods without getting eaten up, and kids getting baked in ovens. Don't know about all those things that we call fairy tales. But I remember ogres being involved. And when we think about the Bible and some of the stories in the Bible sometimes, I've talked to non-believers who at times try to convince me that God is an ogre, that God's mean, and they'll quote stories out of the Bible where, and that they're in there about all the women and children of conquered peoples are to be killed, or what about the one where the earth opens up and swallows a bunch of people who were disobedient? Poisonous snakes run rampant and kill a bunch of people, or Israel's defeated, taken captive by foreign nations. We know these stories. We've read them. We hear about them. And you don't have to be an unbeliever sometimes to wonder what's going on with some of these things. You ever read any stories like that and thought, now what in the world is God up to with that? That just seems out of character for the God that I would like to believe that I worship. We might wonder what God's purpose is or what he's doing. It's okay to wonder, but there's answers to those things, and I think sometimes if we look at things afresh, we might learn some things. So let's look at one story today. You'll be turning to Genesis 22 if you would. You've got your Bible there. And this is probably one of the prime stories, and for years I've read this story, and there's always these things that don't seem to fit, don't seem to jive with that story and with God. And so let's read back through it. Let's look at this a little bit and see what we can learn. I'll just give you a version. I won't read every verse in the story because it's the whole chapter really. But here's one version of what it might be said. God wanted to know if Abraham would obey him no matter what. So he told Abraham to offer Isaac, his son, as a human sacrifice. So Abraham headed for the mountain with firewood, with knife, and with Isaac in tow. They built an altar. He then bound Isaac, laid him on the wood, raised the knife to kill him. But the angel of the Lord yelled, "Stop! Now I know," the voice said, "that you fear me and won't withhold anything from me." So they took a ram that was caught in a bush, coincidentally, nearby, and offered it instead to satisfy God's need for death and blood. And then God blesses Abraham. Well, that's one way you might put it. I've heard it put worse ways than that. That's kind of a middle of the road. Depending on who you're talking to, it can even sound worse than that. Put God in a worse light than that. But do you see any problems with that story told that way? Does any of that make us feel uncomfortable? Well, I'd like to go through this story with us a little bit and look at it from a different perspective than that story that I just read to you, and see if we can learn some things about God from the story. We're going to ask several questions as we go through, and we're going to save the most important question to the very end. So you have to stay with me, or you will miss the very most important question at the end. In verse 1, this is in Genesis 22, in verse 1, it says, in my Bible, at least this is the wording, sometime later God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham. What does that mean when God tests somebody? Well, the Hebrew word there connotes, at least from, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but this is what the books say, it means to prove the character or the faithfulness of someone. It's to prove the character of the faithfulness of someone. But sometimes we might look at that and say, well, God's testing, meaning God's tempting. God's putting something in front of Abraham to try to trip him up. He's doing something that's to see if he can fake him out, get him to do something he shouldn't do. Or maybe even sometimes we might think God's tempting us into sin when things pop up in front of us. We might go, oh, well, God's just tempting me with that, but I'm going to overcome it. Well, James 1:13 says that when we're tempted, no one should say that God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. And in that sense, what we think of as temptation, as something being thrown in front of us to try to draw us away to something else, that's not the way God operates, it tells us. He's not going to throw things out in front of us to try to make us stumble. It goes on to say in James that we may be tempted by our own desires in the very next verse. And of course, we know throughout the Bible we can be tempted by Satan, as Jesus was, and as we all know we can be, and he's the great tempter. But that's not what's being talked about here in Genesis 22, I don't believe. God is testing Abraham to prove his character, but not to tempt him or to trip him up into some sin. And there's a huge difference between testing us and tempting us. We'll come back to that in a little bit later on as well. In verse 2, God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now that's a little uncomfortable, to say the least. I've never had children, but many of you have. And the thought of taking one of them and offering them as a sacrifice usually freaks parents out. That's like, no, wouldn't do that. Can't imagine that God would ask me to do that. But why did God say this? Why did God say this? And again, what I'm saying here today is what I've come to understand with a little more clarity. It's not a doctrine. This isn't like, thus saith the Lord. You have to believe exactly what I'm explaining here, or you're not a Christian type of thing. This is my understanding of something that's always bothered me as being a point of just trying to figure out who God is. So he does tell him to go sacrifice. I mean, it's pretty plain. That's what he tells him to do, is take off to Mount Moriah with your son. And I've learned just in my years of being a Christian that when God says or does something that seems outlandish, that there's usually a pretty important lesson to be learned from it. He gets our attention sometimes in ways that we wouldn't imagine, but there's always something that he's trying to tell us. So I think about the situation, the culture of Abraham. I think about where he was in life. Was Abraham a Christian? Well, of course not. He lived 2,500 years or so before Christ, so he didn't know anything about that. Was he a Jew? Well, no, the Jews weren't around for another 1,000 years or better after this, so he wasn't even a Jew. So he didn't have the codified law, he didn't have the Ten Commandments. There's just a lot that he didn't have at that point. Where was Abraham when God called him? There's a place called Ur of the Chaldees. Anybody ever been to Ur of the Chaldees? On a vacation, trip, anything? No? Well, we're not quite sure exactly where it is, but somewhere over in southeast Iraq. Not a part of the world you probably take your vacations in these days. So it was down there in southeast Iraq. What religion would Abraham have been? Well, there was a religious, I don't know all about it, but it was a Sumerian culture, it's called. They worshipped various gods. It wasn't a monotheistic religion. They didn't worship the God. They worshipped various gods. In fact, in Joshua 24, 2 through 3, it says that when Abraham was called, that he was in this land worshiping other gods. That's what they did there. They worshipped other gods. Abraham had to be taught who God was, had to be called by God, and brought out of a pluralistic culture that worshiped various gods. That's why some of these things were taught to Abraham. They had gods like in America, our early inhabitants of the country here, many places in the world have many gods because they need help with, they think, with controlling rain or heat, drought, having good crops, winning a war against another nation possibly. It's all kinds of reasons that people would have various gods over this or God over that or God to take care of that. And that's more likely the kind of background that Abraham was living in. I remember growing up hearing stories about the Inca Indians and the Aztec Indians. Y'all remember those down in Central America and so forth? And volcanoes. Remember stories about volcanoes and virgin daughters thrown off the edge of volcanoes into the molten lava? And it's just, you just look and go, wow, what kind of people are we? But that's what their gods wanted. That's what their gods expected. That's how you appease the gods. Roman mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, if you took that in junior high and high school, some of the stories resembled that as well. So you have this culture, this religion that Abraham was surrounded by, where there was multi-gods for these various purposes. And so in a sense, the instruction to God, or by God to Abraham, would have made sense. Would have been something Abraham was used to. It wouldn't appear probably as shocking to him as it does to you and me, because he was surrounded by that kind of a thing. It might have been seen as an honor to sacrifice your child to appease the gods, because obviously they're your gods. And so you would do that to appease them, and that would put your child, I guess, in a place of honor in that sense. But is that what God was really expecting out of Abraham? Let's go on into the story a little more. Verses 8 through 10, we jump down here and read verses 8 through 10. It says that they've gone up to the mountain now, they've built an altar, they put the wood on the altar, they're getting ready. And of course, Isaac, the one and only son, the son through which all the blessings would come, the son who, back in Genesis earlier in the book, when Abraham couldn't have children, and God promised him that he would have a son. And through that son, the blessings, the lineage would come. And so here was his son carrying the wood up and helping build the altar. And Isaac said, "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. And when they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood, bound his son Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. That's what the story says. He took the knife to slay the son. In pagan religions, like would have been extant at that time, no one stepped in to pay your penalty for anything. Each person or community was responsible to appease their gods in their own way, their own gods, through the sacrifice of their own, probably usually animals, but sometimes, as we read about in history, sometimes it was human beings were sacrificed, and it's awful what went on. In Hebrews 11, and I'm going to go back there because I want to read this part. It's not that Joe didn't do a good job. Joe did a great job. And those are the verses I had him read because they would tie in well to today. But just the last set that he read, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice, or would have, or was prepared to. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." So Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. God did not take Isaac as a sacrifice, never intended to. You can figure that out when you read later when God gave rules and regulations to Israel, such as the Ten Commandments about not killing and so forth. It was kind of important. And there's other places in the Torah, the books of Moses, where God clarifies that nations who did this sort of thing were despicable, and this was a horrible practice. And so God spoke out very clearly against any kind of human sacrifice. did not like it at all. So Abraham knew that in the midst of this story, that God was going to fulfill his promises. Abraham didn't know how God was going to do it, but it hinted that he even suspected that if God had to, he could raise Isaac back from the dead. So there was a level of faithfulness there of Abraham that maybe you or I would have struggled with, especially if we were in the midst of that story with all the emotions being tied up that were going on at the same time. So we come down in the story a little farther there in Genesis 22, and we come down to verse 12, when he says, this voice says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Who was the test for? Who was this test for? Was it for God? Is there something God didn't know about Abraham, and this is the way he decided he'd find it out, was to put this command in front of him to see if he would fulfill it? What does the term omniscient mean? Anybody got an idea? It's one of those omni words that's used to describe God a lot of times. All-knowing. Yeah. Yeah, God is said to be omniscient, said to be all-knowing. Sometimes we can just look at that as kind of a moral sense, some kind of big, fluffy, heavenly sort of way. But if God's really all-knowing, then he's all-knowing. That means he knows everything. And this gets kind of into philosophy and the ways of thinking a little bit here. We have free will, don't we? And so you and I, when faced with any circumstance, we will decide what to do, whether it's what we're going to eat for breakfast, which car we're going to buy, or some moral value that we have to pick, whether we'll go the right way, the wrong way, God's way, the other way. So we have the ability to decide that. So we have free will. But somehow mixed in with that and over that, God is omniscient. And so while we're making our decisions, it's God sitting around going, well, I'm just waiting to see what they decide there because I don't have a clue what they're going to do. You and I are limited. We know the past because either we've lived it, if it pertains to us, or someone's written or told us about the past. We know the present because we're here right now. We know what's happening. The future, don't really know, do we? Now, we might make guesses about it. We might see certain trends. We might think we know, but none of us really knows the future. And so time to us, life, is a line. It's a chronological line of which there are points as we move across that line. I guess from your point of view, we're moving across from left to right this way. And we don't know what the next thing is until it happens, and then we know it happens. And so everything is, we have a past and a present, and we have a future. I think God's view of time is more like if we took that straight line that we have, and then we put a big bowl over it, upside down. And God sees that. That's the periphery that he has. He sees it all. He just sees it. He just knows it. It's not like past, present, and future, because God's not tied down by time. So he just sees everything. Now, did he know Abraham was going to do that? Well, yeah. So this test, to me, it wasn't for God to figure out what Abraham was going to do. It was for Abraham to figure out what Abraham was going to do and to know what he would do as a result. God knows and declares the end from the beginning, it says in Isaiah. And we get tied up sometimes in that linear thought, and we tie God into that, and we forget that he's all-encompassing and all-knowing, and that time doesn't matter in that sense to him. We won't find any Bible verses, I don't think, where God is quoted saying, "Wow, I'm surprised," or "I never knew that would happen," or "You caught me off guard with that one," or "I never saw that one coming," or "I didn't have a clue what he would do." I don't remember verses like that in there. And so it's kind of odd, but when I look at that story, I look at that like God knew what Abraham would do because he has this omniscient view, but Abraham didn't know what Abraham was going to do. And it was important that Abraham figured out what he would do. What do you think it did to Abraham's faith? What would it do to your faith? To my faith? If we made a decision and God looked down and said, now I know that you fear and revere and respect me and trust me. Now I know that. And I think when God says, now I know, it doesn't mean like I'm enlightened, like God is now enlightened. But now you and I, we have this understanding that God understands where we're coming from. We've made our decision, and now we're on the same page as God in that way. Wish we could be on the same page in everything that we do, but not so. So in our tests and trials, I think you and I are the ones that are enlightened, not God. He doesn't need to be enlightened and taught. He doesn't need to know things that he doesn't know. These things are for our good. They're not for God's good. They're for us. That's why he created us. That's why we go through the tests and trials. The test in this story, I think, was to illuminate Abraham's character to Abraham, not to illuminate Abraham's character for God, something that he didn't already know because he did know it. So that's kind of the way I look at the kind of the time frame of how that fits together and what God's doing. Let's look at the last set of verses in question here, verses 13 through 14. It says, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. Kind of coincidental, wasn't it? Ram. Wow. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. So what was the lesson of the ram in the thicket? You're probably way ahead of me on this one already. Yeah. God provides the sacrifice. God provides the sacrifice. And when we think of the Bible as a story, Old Testament, New Testament, writing, Psalms, Proverbs, the whole bit, prophecies, everything points to Jesus. The Bible's about Jesus. Some of the strangest parts of the Bible that we struggle to make sense of sometimes, they're about Jesus. Now, I don't have it all figured out yet. I'm guessing none of you have it all figured out yet. But if we're reading something in the Bible and we're not learning something about God's nature and his character and his plan as revealed to us through Jesus Christ, we're probably missing something very important in the story or in the history or in the whatever part of the Bible we're reading. Jesus takes the place of any attempts we may make to provide our own sacrifice. You and I do that sometimes. We haul our wood up the mountain and we take our flame with us and we build our altars. Not literally, but in our lives. We love to do those things sometimes. We can fix it. We can work it out. We can make it right. And really that's not our job. God will provide the sacrifice. And he's done that in Jesus Christ. So no size of altar we can build or no amount of wood we can bring. Nothing we have is valuable enough to cleanse ourselves in God's eyes. But the good news is that God has provided the perfect, once for all sacrifice. And that sacrifice reconciles all men and women to God in the offspring of Abraham, in his seed, as it's called in the Old Testament and clarified in the book of Galatians, chapter 3, that out of Abraham will come a seed. And Paul clarifies that with a capital S, that the seed would come, that single person, that Jesus, out of the lineage of Abraham and Isaac, who did not die on the altar that day, that was God in the flesh, that he is the lamb that Isaac was asking about. Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham said, God will provide a lamb. And he did. He provided the lamb. He didn't have to kill Isaac. God lost his son later. It was a willing and free will offering and sacrifice. Abraham counted that God could bring Isaac back to life, and through Jesus Christ, you and I have been brought from eternal death to an eternal life. So that's, to me, much of the story that was covered in Genesis 22. What's the most important question I can think of out of all that? We asked 5 questions up to this point. What would I say might be the most important question? I've hinted at it earlier. What does this story tell us about God and his character? What does this story tell us about God and his character, his nature, his purpose, his plan? If we're reading the story and not learning something about God, we're missing something in the story. Here's what I think might be being taught here. That God is love, and that love is fully revealed in Jesus. That God cares, he supports, sometimes he warns, he encourages, he gives hope, he's full of mercy. He does not tempt us, he does not trick us, he doesn't try to test us in a negative way by making us trip up and stumble. He does not ask more of us than we can give, and when we need more than we think we can give, he provides the more that we need from himself. He provides freely the sacrifice necessary to have us in relationship with him. So maybe a better version of the story might say something like this. God was calling Abraham for a very special purpose. And he wanted to test Abraham's character, to reveal some positive attributes to Abraham, and to contrast the ways of Abraham's pagan multi-god worship and the worship of the one true God. So God told Abraham, to offer Isaac, which seemed reasonable within Abraham's religious context. Abraham headed for the mountain with firewood, knife, and Isaac, built an altar, bound Isaac, laid him on the wood, raised the knife to kill him, but the angel of your Lord yelled, "Stop! Now, Abraham, you can see that I know that you fear me and won't withhold anything from me. I call you my friend, and I bless you." I like that version of the story. I may have it a little wrong here and there, but I think the gist of it is that God isn't an ogre. God's not a monster. He's not mean. He's not tempting. He's not putting us in circumstances just to see if we can flub up. But he's giving us himself freely as our sacrifice in every way. So we don't want to see God as an ogre giving a bloodthirsty command that is out of character for the God who is elsewhere described as pure love. We want to see more deeply that in our trials and tests along the way, we can revere and trust God. We can listen to him. We can obey because we realize his love and mercy for us. We realize he has provided the ram in the thicket for all of us, the perfect lamb, Jesus, to forgive us, to hold us in a right relationship with our great and loving God. God is not an ogre. He is pure love, and we can trust him always.